Thank you very much. And first of all, I wanted to take the chance to thank Professor Gooding and everyone else for who is involved in hosting this and giving me the opportunity to speak to an audience that is well outside of where I've usually been presenting this kind of work. And I'm especially excited to actually be presenting it right after Professor Nicolini's talk, which I think has entirely changed the framing of how this is going to work, as I try to prove to all of you that this very digital method is not quite ChatGPT and might be a bit more open. But I also am very excited to present this, and it's a shame Professor Warren is not here, as I think it's very complementary to the talk he just gave earlier today regarding the environmental impacts and degradation caused by the Trans-Pacific Galleon trade, as this is going to be touching upon what was happening in the South, where he is, of course, also very familiar. Now, just to give a quick overview of this particular talk, I am coming at this particular presentation as the intersection of my ongoing projects, particularly work with Panthropocene, which, as you mentioned, is a project trying to model the land use changes over time of the Philippines, and in some ways a measurement of the impacts of the entry of Spanish colonial forces into the Philippine Islands. But more than that, it also is meant to chart and create models for responses to Spanish involvement in the islands that included acts such as resistance or the indirect effects, to put it of both the actions of Spanish colonialization, but also the penetration of an increasing trade into the Philippines that predated the Spanish conquest and indeed permitted a lot of interactions that were well outside of European-centric narratives. So in this particular project, I will quickly try to give a brief, I will quickly try to give a brief summary of the modeling system we use and the mentality behind it, and how that intersects with Panthropocene, and how ultimately that brings us into the topics of this particular conference, particularly rating the Sulu zone and the environment. And I'll focus at that point on shipbuilding and forest cover and the kind of signals that these models can pick up, as this is a more indirect approach to trying to chart the environmental impacts of slaving and raiding. And by the end of it, I hope that that title I gave, Forest and Slaving, towards quantifying the effects of raiding the Philippines circa 1780, I hope every word of that title by the end will make sense of this in both the ordering and the emphasis. So to start, regarding the mentality of land use models, there has been a pronounced interest in their improvement in the last 10 to 15 years as narratives of the Anthropocene have come to the fore in scholarship everywhere. And one of the challenges of this is the initial land use models were highly environmentally sophisticated, being well aware of different ecotones and ecosystems in general, but ultimately averaging out human behavior as something along the lines of all humans, no matter what their position, require this much land to subsist, and all of human action is integrated into food production and nothing more. And these models have become progressively more sophisticated over time, and as that's happened, there's also been a paring back of the environmental determinism that is inherent to some of these earlier models, and more of an emphasis on creating models with as few calculations as possible, that are as accessible as possible, and as fluid and flexible as possible, to capture the wide array of different forms of sociocultural and socioeconomic interaction with the environment, all the forms that create land use. And these models have ultimately, have led us to the modeling system the Panthropocene project and I use, which we have called, in a friendly way, circle diagrams, where these are actually based off a calculation. These are based off a calculation where one, instead of trying to find an optimum form of land use or a land use that must have existed in the past, uses a series of basic equations, and I say basic as in algebraic, to connect the biophysical requirements of the things that people rely on, whether that be wood for fuel, crops, animals, or in more recent times, as these become more and more apparent, energy sources such as coal, mining resources, and etc., to calculate the minimum land required to sustain a population of size P, practicing a lifestyle L at a point in time T. What this means is a very hypothesized and abstract notion of how people live, where a population does not grow nor shrink in an approximation of what might be called an average year. Ultimately, this method, which was originally developed for charting out land use in West Africa 6,000 years ago and up to around 1500 CE, relies on a kind of relies technically on an imprecision of chronology, not having exact dates, but having the dates that come out of radiocarbon dating or other approximations based on archaeological research, anthropological research, and oral histories, which means that there is an embrace at some level of that uncertainty to create the notion of, at a point in time, or circa a point in time, what is required at the bare minimum for a population to sustain itself, presuming no migration, presuming no constant movement, or in the case of a hunting and foraging society, presuming constant movement, but over a large area that has to sustain a population at different points. And at that point, the scale of the model, how many years you cover and what great a distance you cover, also affects your resolution, your ability to make precise statements about certain areas versus larger areas. And the calculations here are just an example of this, where caloric demand for a single person in a whole year has been calculated, multiplied by the population, and that amount, the energy the population requires, can also be expressed as population times the per capita consumption of different food items. This is one of the many calculations we use. And ultimately, all this, unlike some models, can fit on a single spreadsheet. And I will discuss next how we visualize that, because once we have all those calculations, we visualize the calculated minimum land use given L and P using a circle diagram. And this circle diagram differentiates land use types by transformative capacity. In this case, what I have mapped out here are theoretical lifestyles achronologically for Philippine shifting cultivators, loosely based on the Hanungo of Mindoro, which were very famously studied by Harold Conklin. And based on the very detailed account of shifting cultivation he gave there over a 10-year cycle, what was produced here were two simulations based on if you had a highland population practicing shifting cultivation using only Austronesian available crops versus if you had that same population using upland rice and working with Colombian crops, that are crops that came from the Americas through things such as the galleon trade or around the Indian Ocean. And this was meant to more than anything show the ease of comparison and the reason for creating such models, which are in this case very abstract and have land arranged without any reference to where it is in the real world. So for instance, the settlement is at the center here in a way that reflects an old von Thunen diagram, but this is merely for the sake of comparison, and intensity here being defined by the transformation of the physical environment. So in this regard, rice agriculture, riziculture, is highly transformative of an environment, even though it is actually a very stable, as has been discussed previously, a very stable form of agriculture. So the purpose of this at that point, if you look at the scale below, is to make ease of comparison between two settlements, both in this case of size of population 15. And I'm just realizing I never started the slideshow, excuse me. No, but of a population of 15, and meant to show that land use with the Colombian crop introduction and rice agriculture contracts for a population of this size. And ultimately, such lifestyles, where each diagram presents a lifestyle, may then be mapped out. In this case, I am borrowing from collaborators who first performed this act in West Africa, where they mapped out separate lifestyles for the year 1500. And this was performed by Kay et al. And that citation is a little bit further down, where the purpose of this was to then say, if you had a map in 1500 CE or 450 BP, to compare it to 6,000 years ago and to ask how land use had changed, both in terms of the extent of it and the different types and practices involved. And this ultimately is an agglomeration of archaeological data from, I believe, 6,000 plus entries. So the coverage in this case is extrapolated from 6,000 case studies, all of which have incomplete data, which are brought together. And for the Panthropocene project, the goal is to take that system and apply it instead in the much more recent past, in the first and second global age, to the old Spanish Empire. And this is where the notion Panthropocene comes from. It stands for Pantropical Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene narrative is one that sometimes lends itself to this notion of historical equality. All people have contributed equally to the current biodiversity, atmospheric, and environmental crises that afflict us. But we know that not to be the case. And amongst the various ways of describing this crisis, the head of the ERC Panthropocene project, Dr. Patrick Roberts, has described it in terms of unequal extraction of tropical resources and impoverishment of tropical peoples as a result, towards the enrichment of places such as Europe and what Alfred Crosby described as the Neo-Europes. And so in this case, the Panthropocene project hopes to create models starting in the Philippines at 4 points in time, just prior to the arrival of Miguel de Legazpi in Cebu and the establishment of a permanent Spanish colony there. Again in 1640, in what Jim Warren previously described as the harrowing years, that also marked the end of the first major silver cycle. 1780, which is what I'll be talking about further, which was to describe the ending points of the galleon trade and the rise increasingly of, increasingly the rise of a monocrop agriculture. And finally, in 1900, approximating the end point of the Spanish colonial period and the start of the American colonial period, with these time points also chosen with the hopes of being able to use them in other places in the tropics, particularly in the old Spanish Empire, in the old Spanish colonized states, as well as the Portuguese and other Iberian, as well as the Portuguese Brazil, to measure ultimately through a discussion of land use, how land cover, which is to say what covers the land such as forests, changed, and then plug this into climate models. And in this case, to discuss this very briefly, one can actually see in the sources brought together in this the propagation of uncertainty from the initial quantification of qualitative material to arraying that as a lifestyle, which inherently is extrapolating, to then putting it onto land use maps, such as the one shown previously, and ultimately pushing it towards land cover, which is an approximation based on those land use maps of intensity leading to what extent of deforestation. But that is not actually trying to locate where forests were and weren't present precisely. It is trying to approximate and say, based on calculations, here are the range of possibilities of how much wood, how much material had been required or cleared. And in this regard, what the models do that is not shown here, because it is difficult to do this without showing 1,000 diagrams at once, is the capacity to very quickly model the uncertainty or the disagreement between sources, and to ask questions such as, if a written source says this and an oral history says this, how do we put, what bias do we express towards these sources? What do we value more? And also, if we model both, does one become physically impossible versus does one become versus do both actually exist within the realm of possibility, but only one is plausible or are both plausible? And we can test this in this ways with these models. So at this point, this brings us to how this particular paper and project intersects with the Slavery, Bondage, and Environment Conference, and in particular, the Sulu Zone. So at the time point for 1780, with the Panthropocene project being designed around Spanish colonial extent, it is also designed around measuring some of the impacts caused, direct and indirect as mentioned, by Spanish colonial expansion, and ultimately it being pushed out in the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th century, and then in the Philippines at the end of the 19th century. But there are also, of course, groups that exist outside the Spanish colonial aegis who are experiencing land use change of their own. We previously, as a project team, put out a paper modeling this in Ifugao, where the famous rice terraces were built, following Professor Acabato's paracolonialism hypothesis that the rice terraces of the Philippines are in fact very recent creations, made in part in response to lowlanders moving into the highlands to avoid Spanish conquest and to better resist it. But there's also, of course, the famous quote unquote pirate states of the Sulu Zone. That is to say, the Muslim sultanates of Borneo, Maguindanao, and then ultimately Jolo. And by 1780, we find ourselves trying to model, while having to account for the fact that the models will pick up the actions of the multi-ethnic Sulu Sultanate that is currently sending raiders, as Professor Warren has discussed, as part of an effort as part of its integration into European and Asian trade networks, where raids provide labor, labor provides resources for trade, and trade ultimately provides economic and social capital for further raiding, engaging in a cycle that encourages further raiding into the Spanish Visayas, Bicol, and parts of Luzon, as well as, of course, throughout parts of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And for the Panthropocene project in particular, we at that point are trying to distinguish the signals that come from, for instance, Aranan raiders, which were more prevalent along the coast of the Philippines, as opposed to the Balangingi, which were, based on Professor Warren's work, more likely to move westwards. But at that point, there comes a question of what these land use models, which are not designed to describe slavery when raiding, but ultimately will find signals of it, and where they might find them. And at that point, what we see is that from the Sulu zone, much like Professor Warren discussed with galleons, one of the constant signals we will see is shipbuilding and the maintenance of ships for raiding. In this instance, that would be, remembering something Professor Warren once shared with me, discussions of 40 ships appearing on the horizon and attacking a town, each one carrying something along the lines of 100 warriors, not to mention, and rowers. And that's before going away with slaves. So there comes a question of how does one maintain such vessels? How does one build them? And how often do things such as typhoons, storms, or just rot at sea, or for that matter, resistance to them, lead to a need to fix them, and how extensive are such fixes? Simultaneously, population reallocation may play a role in a signal we can detect, whether that be increased agriculture and resource extraction from the Sulu zone, reflecting that building incorporation into larger trade networks, or a decrease in agriculture or the intensity of it, such as the shifting from sedentary riziculture to shifting agriculture based on upland rice in the highlands in areas constantly afflicted, such as North Mindanao, the Visayas, Mindoro, and South Luzon, or even alternatively, the condensation of populations within small fortress towns meant to protect them from constant raids, as happened in parts of Samar. And ultimately, I would just conclude at that point that in building such a model, the questions that would immediately become apparent are how Alanong, that being the Aranan raiding ships, the Garay, the Arangingi, and the Salisipan, the smaller ships, constructed? What materials are needed? How many trees? What types of species are preferred? Is deforestation caused by repairing these ships then preferential towards certain species, where we see hardwood species like Malave disappear while the Pterocarpacia forests actually expand? And then of course, how many laborers are there and how are they fed? We do know that we do know, for instance, that some slaves sent to Borneo were used to grow rice. And in this regard, the rice they produced was then traded upriver and ultimately ended up back in places like Jolo, where it was seen as a prestige crop to consume for those with wealth, just as the ownership of slaves was. And so there are questions of, are laborers fed such rice? Are they fed other crops? Where are those crops grown? Where are they coming from? And at that point as well, in a similar vein, how many ships are in existence circa 1780? What is the size of a raiding fleet, as mentioned, and the prevalence of each vessel? And for instance, in 1780, there might be more prevalence of Lanong versus in the 1800s, when the Garay become more prevalent based on Professor Warren's work. And finally, as mentioned, maintenance is how frequent and to what extent. And these are the kinds of data that I'm afraid to say I was not able to gather before this talk, as I was in field work until last week in the Philippines. However, such information does actually exist and has been gathered, either from anthropologists and ethnographers throughout the last 120 years, or more recently in the works by Professor Warren, as well as others who have done extensive work on the construction of these vessels, as well, and gathered together resources from archives, oral histories, and archaeological data. So in this way, I would like to conclude just because, excuse me, let me make sure of this. Yes, I have 2 minutes. I would like to conclude just by responding a bit to the call for reflection from Professor Nicolini and say, with regards to this method that requires quantification of often qualitative sources, there's definitely the potential I find for either the incorporation of new narratives or for reaffirmation of Eurocentric narratives, and the constant need to not only capture societies that exist outside of this textual evidence base, but also to reflect the disagreement and inherent differentiations between the societies and their complexity is what such models need to strive for, even if they were not initially built for it. And that is ultimately how we can assess whether a tool is working for us or ultimately confining us. I hope this one will be in the former, but leave it to the rest of you to find that out. So thank you all very, very much for your time, and I hope I haven't gone over with that last bit.
That was perfectly timed. Thank you.